It is 3 minutes before 6 on the morning of December 19th, 1941. In the bowels of the British battleship HMS Valiant, two Italian prisoners sit in darkness. They are cold, exhausted, and soaking wet. They have not slept. For nearly 3 hours they have been confined in this steel compartment, deep below the waterline. What the British do not know is that directly beneath where these men sit, just feet below the hull, rests 300 kilograms of high explosive. The timer is running, and the man who placed it there is one of these two prisoners. His name is Lieutenant Luigi Durand de la Penne. And in approximately 15 minutes, the bomb he dragged across the harbor floor with his bare hands is going to detonate. He has a choice to make. But to understand what brought this Italian naval officer to this impossible moment, trapped aboard a ship he has just condemned to destruction, we must go back. Back to a Mediterranean sea that has become a graveyard of empires, back to a nation desperate for a victory, and back to a weapon so strange, so improbable, that those who wrote it called it the pig. This is the story of how 6 men accomplished what an entire fleet could not. By December 1941, Italy's Regia Marina, the Royal Navy, faced a humiliating reality. Despite possessing one of the largest fleets in the Mediterranean, including modern battleships that could match anything the British deployed, Italy had repeatedly failed to challenge British dominance. The reasons were numerous and demoralizing. Chronic fuel shortages meant Italian warships often remained in port. Unlike the Royal Navy, Italian vessels lacked radar, forcing them to fight blind in the fog of war. And perhaps most damaging of all, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had cracked Italian naval ciphers. The Mediterranean fleet knew Italian intentions before Italian captains received their orders. The consequences had been catastrophic. In March of 1941, at the Battle of Cape Matapan, Admiral Andrew Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet had ambushed an Italian squadron south of Greece. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers lay at the bottom of the sea. Over 2,000 Italian sailors were dead. It was Italy's greatest naval defeat of the war. After Matapan, Italian admirals were forbidden from seeking battle with British capital ships. Yet control of the Mediterranean remained essential. Whoever commanded these sea lanes controlled the fate of North Africa, and with it, access to Suez, the Middle East oil fields, and the strategic balance of the entire war. By late 1941, Malta-based British aircraft and submarines were destroying 63% of all Axis supply convoys bound for Rommel's forces. The Africa Corps was being strangled. Italy needed a victory, but conventional battle had proven suicidal. A different approach would be required, a radical approach, an approach that would ask just 6 men to accomplish what the entire Italian Navy could not. The target would be the crown jewels of the British Mediterranean fleet, the battleships HMS Valiant and HMS Queen Elizabeth. Both were moored at Alexandria, the Royal Navy's main eastern Mediterranean base. Both carried 8 15-inch guns capable of engaging any vessel afloat. Both were essential to maintaining British control of the inland sea, and both, the Italians reasoned, might be destroyed not by a fleet action but by 6 men riding 3 ungainly machines through the darkness of an enemy harbor. The craft they would ride had an official designation that sounded almost elegant, Siluro a Lenta Corsa, the slow-running torpedo. But the men who piloted these machines gave them a different name. They called them maiali, pigs. The nickname captured something essential about these weapons. They were temperamental. They were difficult to steer. They had a maddening tendency to dive without warning or surface at the worst possible moment. In the words of those who rode them, they behaved like animals, stubborn, unpredictable, and occasionally dangerous. Picture an elongated cylinder, some 22 feet long and just under 2 feet in diameter, roughly the dimensions of a standard torpedo. At the bow sits a detachable warhead containing 300 kilograms of high explosive equipped with a clockwork timer. Behind this warhead, 2 men sit astride the craft, exposed to the sea, gripping handles like riders on some nightmarish underwater motorcycle. The pilot in front controls a small joystick connected to hydroplanes and a rudder at the stern. His partner behind him carries net-cutting tools and the clamps needed to attach the warhead to an enemy hull. Both men breathe through rubber hoses connected to oxygen rebreathers, closed-circuit systems that produce no telltale bubbles to mark their passage. A small electric motor, just 1.6 horsepower, propels the craft at a maximum speed of 3 knots, slower than a man can walk. The operators might spend hours in frigid water, creeping toward their target, completely blind in the darkness, navigating by compass and memory alone. Everything about the maial demanded exceptional courage. Its speed made escape unlikely. Its exposed seating meant operators endured punishing cold. Its depth limitations, just 50 feet maximum, forced crews to operate within the lethal range of their own weapon if detected. But the maial had one supreme advantage. It could go where no warship could follow. Through harbor defenses, beneath torpedo nets, past searchlights and patrol boats, into the very heart of an enemy anchorage. The unit that would deploy this weapon was called the Decima Flottiglia MAS, the 10th Light Flotilla. Its members were volunteers, every one. They had endured months of grueling training at La Spezia, spending entire nights submerged in freezing water, learning to navigate by sound and feel, pushing their bodies to the limits of human endurance. Their motto captured their ethos: memento audere semper mentis, remember to always dare. In December 1941, the Decima MS was about to dare the impossible. When Commander Ernesto Forza assembled his men to brief them on the Alexandria operation, he did not minimize the danger. His words were simple and devastating. "We want 3 crews for an operation in the very near future," he announced. "All I can tell you about it is that it differs from the Gibraltar operations in the fact that return from it is extremely problematical. Is there anyone who would like to take part?" Every man in the room volunteered. Forza selected 6, 2 men for each of the 3 maiali. Let us meet them. Leading the first team was Lieutenant Commander Luigi Durand de la Penne. At 27 years old, de la Penne was already a legend within the Decima MAS. Born into Genoese aristocracy, he held the title of Marquis. He had rejected a life of privilege to become one of Italy's most daring naval officers. His courage had been proven the year before when the submarine Iride was bombed by British aircraft in the Gulf of Bomba. As the stricken vessel sank, de la Penne had repeatedly dived to rescue trapped crewmen, at one point offering his own breathing apparatus to a dying sailor who refused to abandon his post. De la Penne's partner was Petty Officer Emilio Bianchi, a stocky, unflappable veteran who had served with the Decima MAS since 1937. Bianchi had already survived multiple operations against Gibraltar, including one where his maiali had plunged past the safe oxygen limit of 100 feet. He had pursued it into the depths, nearly blacking out before clawing his way back to the surface. The second team was commanded by Captain Antonio Marcheglia, a naval engineer who had joined the flotilla after the Italian declaration of war. Methodical where de la Penne was instinctive, Marcheglia approached each mission with the precision of a mathematician. His partner was Petty Officer Spartaco Shergat, a skilled diver who would prove essential to their success. The third team consisted of Captain Vincenzo Martellotta, a weapons specialist who had previously worked on torpedo development, and Petty Officer Mario Marino. Their primary target would be an aircraft carrier, if one was present, or failing that, the largest tanker they could find. All 6 men understood the odds. They were entering a heavily defended enemy harbor in slow, unreliable craft, with limited air supply and no realistic prospect of extraction. Their best hope was to complete the mission, scuttle their machines, and evade capture long enough to reach a rendezvous point where a submarine might collect them. None of them expected to see Italy again. On December 3, 1941, the submarine Sierra slipped out of La Spezia Naval Base and disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. Sierra was no ordinary submarine. She had been extensively modified for a singular purpose. Her deck gun had been removed. Her conning tower had been reduced in size. And bolted to her hull, one at the bow, 2 at the stern, were 3 watertight cylinders, each containing 1 maial. Her commander was Lieutenant Commander Junio Valerio Borghese, a name that would become synonymous with Italian special operations. Known as the Black Prince for his aristocratic lineage, his family had produced a pope. Borghese had already led Sierra on successful attacks against Gibraltar. He was considered the finest submarine commander in the Italian Navy. For 10 days, Sierra crept toward Alexandria. During daylight hours, Borghese kept the submarine submerged at maximum depth to avoid British aircraft. Only at night did they surface to recharge batteries and replenish air. They navigated through known minefields, trusting intelligence reports that mines were laid no deeper than 60 meters and holding Skirre below that threshold. On December 12th, the submarine reached La Rose, an Italian naval base in the Aegean. Here, the 6 frogmen who had traveled separately by aircraft joined their vessel. For 3 days, they conducted final preparations, reviewed their targets, and waited. On December 14th, Skirre departed for Alexandria. The weather turned against them almost immediately. A violent storm swept the eastern Mediterranean, forcing Borghese to keep the submarine submerged for extended periods. The crew endured crushing pressure and stale air. For a time, it seemed the mission might have to be aborted. But by December 17th, the storm had passed. The sea grew calm, the skies cleared. On the evening of December 18th, Commander Borghese assembled his crews and made final target assignments. Della Penne and Bianchi would attack the battleship at mooring buoy 57, HMS Valiant. Marcellia and Shergat would target the battleship at buoy 61, HMS Queen Elizabeth. Martellata and Marino would seek the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle, and if she was absent, attack the largest tanker available. That evening, as darkness fell over the Egyptian coast, Skirre approached the entrance to Alexandria harbor. At 8:40 in the evening, approximately 1.3 miles from the commercial harbor, Borghese brought his submarine to outcrop level, just the conning tower breaking the surface. He later described the scene. The weather was perfect. It was pitch dark, the sea very smooth and the sky unclouded. Alexandria was right ahead of me, very close. One by one, the 6 frogmen climbed out of the submarine's hatches. They opened the deck cylinders, mounted their maiali, and started the small electric motors. Before they departed, they paused. There in the darkness, within sight of enemy searchlights, the 6 men shared a flask of brandy. Then they turned their machines toward the lights of Alexandria and began their long, slow approach. It was approximately 9 o'clock at night. They had 9 hours until their charges would detonate. The first obstacle was the harbor boom, a massive anti-submarine net stretched across the entrance to Alexandria's naval anchorage. This barrier was designed to stop exactly what the Italians were attempting. Cutting through it would be time-consuming and dangerous. Going around it appeared impossible. But at 1 o'clock in the morning on December 19th, fortune favored the Italians. 3 British destroyers, including HMAS Nizam, were returning from operations in the Mediterranean. As they approached, the boom gates swung open to admit them. Watching from the darkness, the Italian crews saw their opportunity. As the last destroyer passed through, they accelerated their maiali, such as they could accelerate anything traveling at 3 knots, and slipped through the gap behind the British warships. They were inside Alexandria harbor, but they were not undetected. British patrols, alerted to the possibility of underwater attack, were dropping small explosive charges into the harbor at random intervals. These precautionary depth charges were not powerful enough to destroy a maiali at distance, but they could kill a diver caught in the blast radius. As the Italians crept deeper into the anchorage, explosions punctuated the water around them. The concussions rattled their bodies. The pressure waves disoriented their navigation. They pressed on. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, the 3 teams separated, each heading toward their assigned target. Around them, the silhouettes of warships loomed in the darkness: cruisers, destroyers, the shadowy mass of the French battleship Lorraine. And ahead, vast and silent, the 2 British battleships that were their targets. Each vessel was surrounded by its own torpedo net, a barrier of steel wire mesh designed to catch any torpedo or mine that approached. The Italian crews would need to get past these nets to reach the ship's hulls. This was the moment everything depended upon. Discovery now would mean death. Success would mean crippling the British Mediterranean fleet. In the darkness of Alexandria harbor, with enemy patrols above them and explosive charges detonating around them, 3 pairs of Italian frogmen began the most dangerous phase of their mission. What happened next to Luigi Durand della Penne became the stuff of naval legend. As he and Bianchi approached HMS Valiant, della Penne was already struggling. His dry suit had developed a leak hours earlier, and frigid Mediterranean water had been seeping in throughout the approach. The cold was sapping his strength, cramping his muscles, and clouding his judgment. Rather than attempt to cut through the torpedo net surrounding Valiant, a time-consuming process, de la Penne decided to take his maial over the top of the barrier. It was a risky maneuver, but he was running out of time and energy. They cleared the net and began their final approach. The bulk of Valiant loomed above them, 32,000 tons of steel blocking out the sky. They were perhaps 50 meters from the hull when everything went wrong. The maiali's motors suddenly died. In the silence that followed, de la Penne frantically checked his equipment. The cause was likely a cable from the torpedo net that had fouled the propeller, or perhaps his own safety line tangled in the mechanism. It did not matter. Without power, the craft began to sink, settling toward the muddy harbor floor 17 meters below. The mission appeared finished. After years of preparation, months of training, and 10 days of perilous approach, they had failed within sight of their target. De la Penne refused to accept it. He signaled to Bianchi that they would push the maiali by hand. Together, the two men began hauling the dead weight of their craft along the harbor bottom toward Valiant's hull. The maiali weighed close to 1,400 kilograms. They were pushing it through mud in total darkness, breathing from tanks that would eventually run dry. Then Bianchi's breathing apparatus failed. Whether through malfunction or damage, Bianchi began experiencing symptoms of oxygen deprivation. He was becoming confused, his movements sluggish. De la Penne tried to share his own equipment, but Bianchi was fading fast. With no alternative, Bianchi released his grip on the maiali and struggled toward the surface to find air. He broke the surface beside one of Valiant's mooring buoys, gasping, barely conscious. He clung to the buoy and waited, unable to help further. De la Penne was alone. What followed is almost impossible to believe. For approximately 40 minutes, Luigi Durand de la Penne dragged a 1,400-kilogram torpedo along the harbor floor in complete darkness. He synchronized his movements with the rhythmic sound of a pump operating aboard Valiant, using the noise to mask any sound he might make. His flooded suit had become a freezing weight around his body. His air supply was dwindling. His muscles screamed for rest. He kept pushing. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, de la Penne finally positioned his maial directly beneath Valiant's hull. He was under the forward section of the ship near the A and B turrets. The mud of the harbor floor had prevented him from attaching the warhead to the keel as planned. He simply could not lift it high enough. Instead, he placed the charge on the harbor bottom, approximately 15 feet below the ship's hull. It was not ideal, but it would have to do. He armed the timer. He set it for approximately 6 o'clock in the morning. Then, utterly exhausted, Luigi Durand de la Penne swam toward the surface and his fate. While de la Penne was waging his solitary battle beneath Valiant, the other two teams had achieved their objectives with considerably less drama. Captain Markellia and Petty Officer Shergat successfully navigated to HMS Queen Elizabeth, climbed over the torpedo nets, and located a position beneath the massive battleship. Working efficiently, they attached their warhead to the ship's bilge keel, suspending it just 5 feet below the hull, exactly as designed. The timer was set. By 4:30 in the morning, they had exited the harbor, scuttled their maial in deep water, and begun their escape toward Rosetta, where a submarine was scheduled to extract them. Captain Martellata and Petty Officer Marino searched in vain for the aircraft carrier Eagle, which had been moved from Alexandria. Following their secondary orders, they selected the Norwegian tanker Sagona as their target. Martellata, struggling with nausea from oxygen exposure, remained on the surface, while Marino dove beneath the tanker and attached the charge. By 3 o'clock, both men had reached shore, scattered their remaining equipment, and begun their own escape attempt. The missions were complete. All 3 charges were armed and ticking, but de la Penne and Bianchi would not escape. When de la Penne surfaced, gasping for air, he found Bianchi clinging to Valiant's mooring buoy. Moments later, a British searchlight caught them in its glare. A machine gun fired warning shots into the water. Within minutes, both men had been hauled aboard the very battleship they had just mined. They were brought before Valiant's commanding officer, Captain Charles Morgan. Morgan was not a fool. He recognized immediately that these 2 bedraggled Italians, captured swimming beside his ship at 3 in the morning, represented a serious threat. He demanded to know if they had attached anything to his vessel. De la Penne refused to answer. Morgan tried again. Nothing. The captain made a decision that would become one of the most remarkable moments of the entire war. He ordered de la Penne and Bianchi confined in a compartment in Valiant's lowest deck, the forward section near the bow. This was not random. Morgan placed them there deliberately, in the location he believed most likely to be damaged if there was an explosion. The calculation was simple. If de la Penne had placed a charge under the ship, he would be sitting on top of it when it detonated. Perhaps this knowledge would convince him to talk. Morgan did not know that the compartment he had chosen was directly above the exact location where de la Penne had placed his 300 kilograms of high explosive. The timer continued to run. For nearly 3 hours, Luigi Durand de la Penne sat in the darkness of that steel compartment and waited. He knew what was coming. He knew the approximate time. He knew that when the charge detonated, the blast would rip through the hull feet from where he sat. The force might kill him instantly, or the flooding might drown him, or the concussion might rupture his organs. There were many ways to die in the next few hours. He said nothing. Bianchi sat beside him, equally silent. Both men had been raised in a naval tradition that valued honor above survival. They had volunteered for this mission knowing return was extremely problematical. They had done their duty. Whatever came next, they would face it as naval officers. The minutes crawled past. At approximately 5:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before the scheduled detonation, de la Penne asked his guards if he could speak with Captain Morgan. He was brought to the wardroom. Morgan was waiting. De la Penne looked at the British captain. In a few minutes, Morgan's ship would be destroyed. Hundreds of British sailors were asleep in their bunks, unaware of what was about to happen. The Italian officer had the power to save them, or to remain silent and let them die. He spoke. "There is going to be an explosion in a short time." That was all he would say. He refused to reveal where the charge was placed, how large it was, or when precisely it would detonate. He gave Morgan only enough information to clear the lower decks, nothing more. Morgan acted instantly. He ordered all hands to the upper deck. Watertight doors were sealed throughout the ship. Men scrambled from their bunks and rushed topside. The captain sent search parties below to look for the charge, but time had run out. There was one final decision to make. Morgan ordered de la Penne and Bianchi return to the compartment where they had been held. If the Italians had truly placed a charge, they would share the consequences. The two Italians were escorted back below. The clock struck 6. At 5:47 in the morning, the first explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence. The charge beneath the tanker Sagona detonated, blowing off the vessel's stern and sending a column of water 200 feet into the air. The destroyer HMS Jervis, moored alongside Sagona to refuel, was caught in the blast, her hull torn open by the concussion. Aboard Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, men looked toward the explosion and wondered what had happened. Some thought a mine had struck the tanker. Others suspected an air attack. No one yet understood the full scope of what was occurring. Then, at 6 minutes past 6, HMS Valiant heaved. The explosion beneath the battleship's forward section was massive. The blast punched upward through the harbor mud, through the water, and into the hull. A hole measuring 60 feet by 30 feet was torn in Valiant's bottom, rupturing magazines and flooding compartments. In the forward hold where de la Penne and Bianchi waited, the world became chaos. The deck bucked, the lights failed, the ship lurched as thousands of tons of water rushed in, but the compartment held. The two Italians survived, de la Penne with only a minor head wound. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, was standing on the quarterdeck of HMS Queen Elizabeth at that moment. He watched Valiant shudder from the explosion and began to issue orders. Then, just 4 minutes later, Queen Elizabeth herself erupted. This explosion was even more devastating. The charge that Marcalia and Shergat had carefully placed beneath the keel detonated directly under the battleship's boiler rooms. The blast tore through the double bottom and anti-torpedo bulges across an area measuring 190 feet by 60 feet. Boiler Room B was destroyed. The ship began to flood rapidly. Cunningham was lifted off his feet by the concussion. 8 British sailors died in the explosion, all of them aboard Queen Elizabeth. They were the only fatalities of the entire operation. By 7 o'clock in the morning, both battleships had settled on the harbor floor. The water at Alexandria was relatively shallow, and both vessels came to rest on an even keel, their decks remaining above the waterline. To a casual observer, or to enemy reconnaissance aircraft, they appeared undamaged. But the appearance was deceptive. HMS Valiant would be out of action for 7 months. HMS Queen Elizabeth would not return to service for 18 months. The tanker Sagona would not complete repairs until 1946. The destroyer Jervis would spend a month in dock. 6 men had crippled the British Mediterranean fleet. Admiral Cunningham faced an immediate crisis that extended far beyond damaged ships. If the Axis powers learned what had happened, they might seize the opportunity to sweep the eastern Mediterranean while Britain had no operational battleships. The concealment effort began within hours of the explosions. Cunningham imposed a complete news blackout. No word of the attack was to leave Alexandria. Italian prisoners were isolated. British personnel were forbidden to discuss what had occurred. But the most remarkable aspect of the deception was Cunningham's personal commitment to maintaining appearances. Despite the fact that Queen Elizabeth was listing 15 degrees and in danger of sinking beneath him, Cunningham refused to leave the ship. At 7:40 that morning, less than 2 hours after the explosion, he turned to his staff and said, "We must go and clean or we shall be late for colors." The morning colors ceremony proceeded as scheduled. The Marine Band paraded on deck. Officers went about their routines as if nothing had happened. When reconnaissance aircraft flew over Alexandria, they photographed 2 battleships riding at anchor, apparently undamaged. The deception held for weeks. Only in late January 1942, when an Italian prisoner inadvertently mentioned the raid's success, did the Axis High Command realize what had been achieved. By then, Italian Admiral Marcantonio Bragadin could write with justified pride. Where the Italian fleet had failed, 6 sailors had succeeded. It opened a period of clear Italian naval supremacy in the east-central Mediterranean. What became of the 6 men who had changed the balance of the Mediterranean War? Captain Marcheglia and Petty Officer Shergat came closest to escape. They successfully left the harbor, disposed of their diving equipment, and posed as French sailors as they made their way toward the extraction point at Rosetta. For 2 days, they evaded detection. But on December 21st, Egyptian police intercepted them before they could reach the rendezvous submarine. They were handed over to British authorities. Captain Martellota and Petty Officer Marino were captured even sooner, stopped at an Egyptian checkpoint within hours of landing ashore. De la Penne and Bianchi, of course, were already prisoners aboard the ship they had just destroyed. After the explosion, they were transferred to detention facilities with the others. All 6 men were sent to prisoner of war camps, first in Palestine, then in India. They would remain imprisoned for nearly 2 years. But history was not finished with them. In September 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies and switched sides. The new Italian government sought to repatriate its prisoners and recruit them for the continuing war against Germany. 5 of the 6 Alexandria raiders, De la Penne, Marcheglia, Shergat, Martellota, and Marino, returned to service with the Italian co-belligerent navy. Only Emilio Bianchi declined. The former enemies became allies, and in a twist that would have seemed unimaginable in December 1941, the Italian frogmen who had attacked Alexandria began conducting joint operations with British special forces. In June 1944, a combined British-Italian team penetrated the harbor at La Spezia, now under German control, and sank the Italian cruisers Bolzano and Gorizia, preventing them from being used by Nazi forces. Luigi Durand de la Penne had gone from attacking British ships to attacking German-controlled Italian ships, side by side with his former enemies. The final chapter of this story took place in March 1945 at the Italian naval base in Taranto. Crown Prince Umberto II of Italy had come to present the nation's highest military decoration, the Gold Medal of Military Valor, to the 6 heroes of Alexandria. All 6 men would receive this honor, equivalent to the British Victoria Cross or the American Medal of Honor. The ceremony drew officers from throughout the Italian Navy, as well as representatives from the Allied forces now fighting alongside Italy. Among the senior officers in attendance was a British admiral who had specifically requested permission to be present. His name was Charles Morgan, the former captain of HMS Valiant. Morgan had spent 4 years thinking about that night in December 1941. He had spent hours interrogating a stubborn Italian officer who refused to reveal whether a charge had been placed under his ship. He had made the decision to confine that officer in a forward compartment, hoping to pressure him into talking. And he had watched De la Penne warn him 15 minutes before the explosion that his ship was about to be destroyed, giving Morgan just enough time to save his crew but not enough to find the charge. Morgan had tried to secure a British decoration for De la Penne. The request had been denied, but the British admiral had another idea. As the ceremony proceeded, della Penne stepped forward to receive his medal. Crown Prince Umberto turned to the British officer standing beside him. "Would you do the honor?" the Crown Prince asked. Admiral Charles Morgan stepped forward. In his hands, he held the Gold Medal of Military Valor, Italy's highest award for courage in combat. The man who had commanded the ship della Penne had attacked, who had interrogated him and imprisoned him and nearly killed him, now pinned Italy's greatest honor on his chest. Morgan later wrote of the moment, "I thus had the pleasure and honor of decorating Lieutenant della Penne with the highest award granted by the Italian Navy for the very courageous and gallant attack he made on my ship 3 years and 3 months before. It remains one of the most extraordinary moments of military chivalry in modern history." The Alexandria raid had consequences that extended far beyond the Mediterranean. In the short term, it achieved precisely what Italian naval strategists had hoped. For several critical months, Italy possessed naval supremacy in the central Mediterranean. British convoy operations were severely curtailed. Axis supplies reached North Africa more freely. The strategic balance had shifted, but the British learned from their defeat. Within months of Alexandria, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was demanding that Royal Navy develop similar capabilities. "Please report what is being done to emulate the exploits of the Italians," he wrote in a furious memo. "Is there any reason why we should be incapable of the same scientific aggressive action the Italians have shown?" The result was the British Chariot, an almost exact copy of the Italian maiali. British frogmen would use these weapons against Italian ships for the remainder of the war, including operations alongside their former Italian adversaries. The influence extended further still. After the war, the principles pioneered by the Decima MAS shaped the development of naval special operations forces worldwide. The United States Navy SEALs, the British Special Boat Service, and virtually every modern combat diver unit owes a conceptual debt to those 6 Italian sailors who proved that a handful of determined men could achieve what fleets could not. Luigi Durand della Penne rose to the rank of Vice Admiral in the post-war Italian Navy. He died in 1992, age 77, honored by both his countrymen and his former enemies. Today, a class of Italian destroyers bears his name. Emilio Bianchi, the diver who was forced to surface when his breathing apparatus failed, outlived all his comrades. He died in 2015 at the age of 103, the last survivor of the Alexandria raid. In the early hours of December 19, 1941, 6 Italian naval officers riding 3 slow, unreliable torpedoes entered one of the most heavily defended harbors in the world. They bypassed nets and patrols. They placed charges beneath 2 of the most powerful warships afloat. And when everything went wrong, when engines failed and breathing apparatus malfunctioned and bodies gave out from cold and exhaustion, they completed their mission through sheer determination. One of them dragged a 1-ton explosive device across a harbor floor in total darkness, alone, for 40 minutes. When captured, they revealed nothing that would allow the British to save their ships. And when the moment came, one of them chose to warn his captors, giving them just enough time to save lives, but not enough to prevent destruction. It was, as Winston Churchill reluctantly admitted to Parliament, an extraordinary example of courage and ingenuity. Admiral Cunningham, whose fleet had been crippled, wrote that one cannot but admire the cold-blooded bravery and enterprise of these Italians. The Alexandria raid demonstrated something that military strategists are still absorbing 8 decades later. In an age of battleships and aircraft carriers, of fleets numbering hundreds of vessels and crews numbering tens of thousands, 6 men with exceptional training, innovative technology, and unlimited courage could change the course of a war. They called their weapon the pig because it was stubborn and difficult to control. But on the night of December 18, 1941, 6 men rode those pigs into history. This was Italy's forgotten victory, and it deserves to be remembered.